The briefing room at Naval Amphibious Base Coronado fell silent when she walked in, but it wasn't the respectful kind of silence. It was the kind that came before laughter, the kind that preceded whispers and sideways glances. Lieutenant Kira Vaughn had seen it before, felt it before, and she'd learned to let it slide off her like water off a fighter jet's canopy. Her navy khakis were crisp, her ribbons minimal but telling to anyone who knew how to read them, and her expression was carved from the same stone that built the compound around them. She didn't need to announce herself. The instructor at the front, a brick of a man named Senior Chief Garrett, looked at her with the kind of amusement reserved for cosmic jokes. Behind him, 12 Marines sat in various states of relaxed confidence, their woodland camas still dusty from the morning's exercise. They were Force Recon, the elite within the elite, and they wore it like a second skin. The training evolution was supposed to be routine, a joint special operations exercise designed to foster cooperation between Navy Special Warfare and Marine Special Operations Command. But everyone in that room knew what it really was. It was a test. It was theater. And Kira Vaughn was the punchline walking through the door. One of the Marines, a staff sergeant with a jawline that could cut glass and an ego to match, leaned back in his chair and grinned. "Try not to cry, Princess," he said, loud enough for the room to hear, soft enough to claim deniability if anyone official cared. A few of his buddies chuckled. Senior Chief Garrett didn't reprimand him. He just watched Kira, waiting to see if she'd react, if she'd prove them right about whatever assumptions they'd already made. She didn't react. She took a seat at the back, her gaze forward, her hands loose in her lap. She'd been a naval aviator once, flying FA-18 Super Hornets off the deck of the USS Theodore Roosevelt, threading the needle between sky and sea in missions that would never make the news. But that wasn't enough. It never had been. So she'd walked away from the cockpit and into the crucible, through the cold water and the sand and the tests designed to break people who thought they were unbreakable. She'd earned the trident. She was a Navy SEAL now, one of the first women to do so, and she hadn't done it for validation. She'd done it because there was a part of her that needed to know if she could. Senior Chief Garrett began the brief. The exercise would take place in the Urban Warfare Training Compound, a sprawling maze of concrete buildings and killhouses designed to simulate the chaos of close-quarters combat. The Marines would be the opposing force, tasked with defending a high-value target somewhere in the compound. Kira's mission was simple in theory, impossible in practice. Infiltrate, locate, and neutralize the target without being compromised. Alone. Against 12 Marines who'd spent their entire careers perfecting the art of violence. The room erupted in laughter when Garrett outlined the scenario. It wasn't mean-spirited exactly, but it wasn't respectful either. It was the laughter of men who'd already decided how this would end. The staff sergeant who'd called her princess leaned over to his buddy and said something that made them both grin. Kira heard it. She didn't respond. She just nodded when Garrett asked if she understood the mission parameters, and she stood when he dismissed the brief. Outside, the California sun hammered down on the asphalt, turning the air into something thick and shimmering. The Marines filed out behind her, already talking strategy, already dividing sectors and establishing fields of fire. They moved with the easy confidence of men who'd done this 1,000 times, who knew each other's rhythms like a favorite song. Kira walked alone toward the armory, her boots striking the pavement in a steady cadence. She could feel their eyes on her back, could hear the low hum of conversation that followed her like a shadow. She didn't care. She'd been underestimated before. She'd been dismissed, overlooked, and written off by people who thought they knew what she was capable of based on her gender, her size, or the softness they imagined in her just because she didn't look like them. They were always surprised. They always learned. At the armory, she checked out a suppressed M4 carbine, a Sig Sauer P226 pistol, and enough ammunition to make the exercise realistic. She didn't take grenades or flashbangs. She didn't need the noise. This wasn't about overwhelming force. It was about precision, patience, and reading the battlefield like a language only she could speak. She loaded her magazines in silence, her fingers moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done this so many times it had become muscle memory. The armorer, a petty officer with graying hair and tired eyes, watched her work and said nothing. He'd seen enough operators come through to recognize competence when it walked through his door. The compound was a quarter-mile away, a cluster of two-story buildings and narrow alleyways designed to replicate the urban environments where modern warfare was fought and won. Kira approached it from the east, moving low and slow through the scrub brush that bordered the training area. The sun was behind her now, casting long shadows that she used like cover. She could see the Marines inside, moving through the buildings with the kind of coordination that came from years of working together. They'd set up a defensive perimeter, posting sentries at the key chokepoints and keeping the bulk of their force mobile and ready to respond. It was textbook. It was predictable, and predictable meant exploitable. She found a position on a low rise about 200 meters out and settled in to watch. Patience was the first lesson they taught you in sniper school, and it was the last lesson most people ever learned. She watched the Marines rotate their sentries, watched them communicate with hand signals and low voices, watched the way they moved and the patterns they fell into without realizing it. Everyone had patterns. Everyone had rhythms, and rhythms could be broken. She noted the staff sergeant, the one who'd called her princess, as he moved through the compound barking orders and adjusting positions. He was their leader, their anchor, and he carried himself like someone who'd never lost. That was a liability. Confidence without caution was just arrogance wearing a uniform. Kira waited until the sun dropped another degree, until the light shifted and the shadows grew longer and deeper. Then she moved. She came in from the north, where the compound backed up against a drainage ditch overgrown with weeds and trash. It wasn't glamorous, but it was concealed, and concealment was better than armor. She low-crawled through the ditch, her rifle cradled in her arms, her breathing controlled and even. The mud soaked through her camas and the smell of stagnant water filled her nose, but she didn't rush. Rushing got you killed. Impatience got you compromised. She'd learned that the hard way years ago in places that didn't have names on maps. She reached the perimeter without detection and paused to listen. Somewhere above her, on the second floor of the nearest building, she could hear boots scraping concrete. A sentry, probably scanning the open ground to the south where any rational person would approach from. She wasn't a rational person. She was a problem solver, and the problem was 12 Marines who thought they'd already won. She slipped through a gap in the chain-link fence that bordered the compound and moved into the shadow of the first building. Her heart rate was steady, her senses sharp. This was the part she lived for, the part where everything else fell away and all that remained was the mission and the moment. The first Marine she encountered was a lance corporal posted at the rear entrance of Building 3. He was young, maybe 22, and he was trying to stay alert, but his eyes kept drifting to his watch, probably counting down the time until the exercise was over, until he could go back to the barracks and tell his buddies how they'd shut down some Navy hotshot. Kira approached from his blind side, moving through the shadows like something that didn't belong to this world. She didn't use her rifle. She used her hands, a quick controlled movement that simulated a takedown, and she pressed her training knife to his throat before he even knew she was there. "You're out," she whispered, her voice barely audible. His eyes went wide, his mouth opened to shout, but she was already gone, melting back into the darkness before he could process what had just happened. One down, 11 to go. She moved through the compound like smoke, using the buildings and the failing light to her advantage. The Marines were good, better than good, but they were defending a position they thought was secure. They were looking outward, not inward. They were expecting an assault, not an infiltration. Kira had spent years learning how to be invisible, how to read terrain and exploit weaknesses, and she applied those lessons now with surgical precision. She took down the second Marine in a stairwell, the third in a hallway, the fourth as he was checking a corner. Each time, she moved before they could raise the alarm, before they could alert the others. Each time, she disappeared before anyone could respond. By the time the Marines realized something was wrong, she'd already eliminated 5 of them. The staff sergeant's voice crackled over their radios, sharp and angry. "Tighten up, she's inside the wire." The tone had shifted. The amusement was gone, replaced by something harder, something that bordered on respect but wasn't quite there yet. They started moving differently, tighter formations, more aggressive sweeps. But tighter formations meant less flexibility, and aggression without information was just flailing in the dark. Kira adapted. She always adapted. She moved to the upper floors, using the elevated positions to watch their patterns, to predict their movements. She wasn't faster than them. She wasn't stronger. But she was smarter, and in this kind of fight, that was enough. The 6th and 7th Marines went down in quick succession, both of them caught off guard as they cleared a room they thought was empty. Kira had been waiting in the ceiling crawlspace, a tactic so old school that no one expected it anymore. She dropped behind them, simulated the kills, and was back in the shadows before their bodies hit the ground. The staff sergeant was shouting now, his voice tight with frustration. Where the hell is she? He was good. She'd give him that. He was trying to hold his team together, trying to maintain order in the face of an enemy they couldn't see or predict. But order required control, and control required understanding. They didn't understand her. They didn't know how she thought, how she moved, how she'd spent years turning herself into something other than what they expected. The 8th Marine fell in the courtyard, taken down as he tried to reposition to cover a different angle. The 9th and 10th went down together, caught in a hallway where they thought they had overlapping fields of fire. They didn't account for the fact that Kira didn't come from the direction they were watching. She came from above, dropping from a second-story window and landing behind them with barely a sound. By the time they turned, it was over. 2 left. The staff sergeant and one other, a gunnery sergeant who'd been quiet during the brief but who moved with the kind of confidence that came from experience. They were in the central building now, the one where the high-value target was supposedly located. They'd pulled back, consolidating their position, trying to force her to come to them. Kira obliged, but she didn't come the way they expected. She didn't breach the front door or rappel through a window. She came through the ventilation system, squeezing through a shaft that was barely wide enough for her frame. It was uncomfortable, claustrophobic, and absolutely not in any tactical manual. But that was the point. Manuals were predictable. She wasn't. She emerged in a storage room on the 2nd floor, her rifle up and ready. She could hear them below, talking in low voices, trying to decide if they should hold position or go looking for her. The gunnery sergeant wanted to hold. The staff sergeant wanted to move. They compromised by splitting up, which was exactly the mistake she'd been waiting for. She took the gunnery sergeant first, catching him as he moved through a narrow corridor that connected the 2 halves of the building. He was good, his weapon up, his movements controlled, but he wasn't expecting her to come from behind. She'd circled around, using a maintenance ladder and a service corridor that didn't appear on the maps they'd been given. By the time he realized she was there, her training knife was at his throat. "Out," she said, and he nodded, his expression a mixture of frustration and grudging respect. 1 left, the staff sergeant, the one who'd called her princess. She found him in the main room, his rifle trained on the door, his body coiled and ready. He was expecting her to come through that door to give him the clean shot he'd been waiting for. She didn't. She came through the window, crashing through the glass in a controlled roll that brought her up on one knee with her rifle already sighted. The staff sergeant spun, faster than she expected, his weapon coming up, his finger on the trigger. For a frozen second they stared at each other across the room, 2 warriors locked in a moment that could have gone either way. Then she fired. The blank round cracked through the air, the sound echoing in the enclosed space. The staff sergeant looked down at the red paint marker on his chest, then back up at her. His expression was unreadable. Then slowly he lowered his weapon. "Clear," he said, his voice flat. The exercise was over. Outside, Senior Chief Garrett was waiting with the rest of the Marines, all of them standing in a loose formation with their gear still on and their expressions ranging from disbelief to something that might have been awe. Kira walked out of the building, her rifle slung across her chest, her face smudged with dust and sweat. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She just stood there, waiting for whatever came next. The staff sergeant emerged behind her, his face unreadable. For a long moment, no one said anything. Then he stepped forward, his hand extended. "That was impressive," he said, and there was no mockery in his voice now, no condescension, just the simple acknowledgement of one professional to another. Kira shook his hand, her grip firm. "Just doing my job," she said. Senior Chief Garrett stepped forward, his arms crossed over his chest. 12 Marines, eliminated in 43 minutes, that's got to be some kind of record. He looked at the assembled Marines, then back at Kira. "Anyone got anything to say?" The staff sergeant cleared his throat. "Yeah, I do." He turned to face his team. "We got beat, fair and square, by someone who was better prepared, better trained, and better at this than we were today. That's not a knock on us, that's a lesson. And if you're smart, you'll learn from it." He looked back at Kira. "What's your call sign?" She hesitated. It wasn't something she advertised. But in this moment with these men who just learned what she was capable of, it felt right to share it. "Phantom," she said. "They call me Phantom." The name hung in the air, and she could see understanding dawn on their faces. Phantom, because she moved like one, fought like one, disappeared like one. Because she was the thing you didn't see coming until it was already too late. The Marines began to disperse, heading back to the armory to turn in their gear and debrief. But the staff sergeant lingered, his expression thoughtful. "Where'd you learn to move like that?" he asked. Kira met his gaze. "The same place you learned to fight." "I just learned a different kind of fighting." He nodded, processing that. "Next time we do this, I want you on my team, not against it." She almost smiled. "We'll see." As she walked back toward the main building, the sun setting behind her and casting the world in shades of orange and gold, Kira Vaughn allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. Not because she'd won, but because she'd proven something that shouldn't have needed proving in the first place. That competence had no gender. That skill was skill, regardless of who possessed it. That underestimating someone based on assumptions was the fastest way to lose. The Marines had learned that today. And maybe, just maybe, they'd carry that lesson forward into the rest of their careers. That's what she hoped anyway. That's what made it all worth it. Later that evening in the debriefing room, Senior Chief Garrett pulled her aside. "You made an impression today," he said. "A good one. Word's going to get around about this." Kira shrugged. "I'm not looking for attention," Garrett smiled. "Too late, you're already getting it. Command wants to see you tomorrow morning. They're putting together a new unit, something experimental. Special operations, high-risk, unconventional warfare. They want operators who can think outside the box, who can adapt to any situation. They want you." Kira felt something stir in her chest, something she hadn't felt in a while. Anticipation, purpose. The sense that she was moving toward something important, something that mattered. "I'll be there," she said. That night, alone in her quarters, Kira sat on the edge of her bunk and stared at the trident pinned to her uniform. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, the sacrifices and the pain and the moments when she'd wanted to quit but hadn't. She thought about the staff sergeant's words, about the lesson they'd learned. She thought about what came next, about the unit command was putting together and the missions they'd send her on. And she thought about the nickname they'd given her. Phantom. It fit. Because she was a ghost in their world, a presence they couldn't quite pin down or predict. And that was exactly how she liked it. The Marines she'd faced that day would tell the story for years to come, embellishing some details and downplaying others, but always ending with the same conclusion. They'd been beaten by someone better. And that someone was a woman named Kira Vaughn, call sign Phantom, who'd proven that the only thing more dangerous than a skilled operator was an underestimated one. The legend was just beginning. The missions would come, each one harder than the last, each one pushing her further and testing her limits. But she was ready. She'd always been ready, because she wasn't fighting for recognition or validation or to prove anyone wrong. She was fighting because it was who she was, what she was built for, and nothing anyone said or thought could change that. In the years that followed, Kira Vaughn would become one of the most decorated special operators in naval history. She'd lead missions in places that didn't exist on official maps, against enemies who didn't wear uniforms or follow rules. She'd save lives, take lives, and walk the razor's edge between heroism and horror with the same steady competence she'd shown that day in Coronado. But she'd never forget the Marines who'd underestimated her, who'd called her princess and laughed at the idea that she could beat them. She'd never forget because they'd been the ones who'd shown her what she was truly capable of. They'd been the ones who'd given her the chance to prove herself. And in doing so, they'd become part of her story, a story that would inspire others to push past their own limitations and reach for something greater. The briefing room that had been filled with laughter and mockery became a place of legend, a reminder that assumptions were dangerous and respect was earned, not given. The staff sergeant who'd made the princess comment would eventually become one of Kiera's closest friends, a relationship built on mutual respect and the shared experience of having tested each other in the crucible of combat training. He'd tell anyone who'd listen that she was the best operator he'd ever worked with, male or female, and that anyone who underestimated her did so at their own peril. And Kiera, for her part, would always remember him as the man who'd given her the motivation to show the world what she was made of. The Navy SEAL community, traditionally insular and resistant to change, began to shift. Not overnight and not without resistance, but shift nonetheless. Kiera's success opened doors for others, women who dreamed of serving in special operations but who'd been told it wasn't possible. She became a mentor, a role model, and a living example that excellence transcended gender. She didn't ask for that role. She didn't seek it out. But she accepted it, because she understood that her actions had consequences beyond herself, that every mission she completed and every challenge she overcame made it easier for the next woman to follow in her footsteps. The compound at Coronado became a place where the story was told and retold, each generation of SEALs and Marines learning about the day Lieutenant Kiera Vaughn took down 12 Marines in 43 minutes. The details would change with each telling, the time would get shorter, the number of Marines would sometimes grow, but the core truth remained the same. Competence, preparation, and adaptability would always triumph over assumptions and arrogance. And the operator who embodied those qualities, regardless of gender, would always win. That was the lesson. That was the legacy. And that was what Kiera Vaughn left behind when she finally hung up her uniform years later, after a career that had taken her to the darkest corners of the world and back. But on that day in Coronado, as the sun set and the Marines filed away and Senior Chief Garrett watched her with something like pride in his eyes, Kiera didn't know about the legacy she was building. She didn't know about the lives she'd change or the barriers she'd break. All she knew was that she'd completed the mission, that she'd proven herself once again, and that somewhere out there, another mission was waiting. Another test. Another chance to show the world what she could do. And she was ready for it. She was always ready, because being ready wasn't a choice. It was who she was.